Okay, so listen, I'll get going. So my name is Luc Arsenault. I'm with the Toronto Stock Exchange, the TSX, but I also have experience with the TSX Venture in my past work experience. So I'm a geologist. I work with the TSX listing staff to, of course, advise and accompany companies that are in the process of going public, so listing on the TSX or TSX Venture. So during this presentation, I'm just going to overview what listing on Canadian market entitles, and more specifically, of course, listing on the TSX or the TSX Venture. Let me get started here. So here in a nutshell is pretty much the summary of what I'll be presenting. So why and how to list on the TSX or the TSX Venture. Of course, TSX is the Toronto Stock Exchange. TSX Venture is the junior stock exchange. So we have the senior listings and the junior listings on both of our markets. Listing as a mining company on Canadian markets requires companies and issuers to be well aware of regulations such as National Instrument 43-101. So we'll be covering some of that. And of course, that means we'll also be touching on technical report triggers and requirements.
So first, let's start. And I guess I'll just high level here. Rich pretty much covered the CPC program. So the means of listing, how you get listed on the TSX is through the IPO, the reverse transaction, the CPC or QT transactions, or you do a list. So you come over from another international exchange and you do a list on one of our markets. But one thing I want to focus on here is the CPC program that Rich covered so well. Is a first step, the CPC step, but then you have the qualifying transaction, which leads to the listing, which can, sometimes qualify the company for a junior listing on the TSX Venture. But we've seen some CPCs after they completed the qualifying transaction actually list on the TSX because the project is more advanced, the company is more capitalized, and that's where the best fit is. So when you're considering a listing on TSX or TSXV, this is the general high-level requirements here. Of course, you need to have that property, the mining property. We look at the management and their track records, working capital, mine life, so the financial requirements, the technical requirements, of course, the technical reports, and you ultimately list either as an exploration company or a producing company. I want to focus here on the property requirements, and this slide is a lot of information, but ultimately you have the left-hand side, which is the TSX Venture listing requirements for the property, and on the right-hand side, the TSX listing requirements for the property. So if we start with the TSX Venture, you can see there's actually two levels of entry here. You have the Tier 1, Tier 2, and Tier 1. But first, let me say whether you're listing on TSX Venture or TSX, the ultimate minimum requirement is that the company holds at least 50% interest in the qualifying property. That means it actually holds the interest, or it has an option to achieve that 50% interest through exploration work or property payments in time. But ultimately, there's a 50% interest threshold pretty much on all categories here. So in terms of TSX Venture Tier 2 requirements, there's a requirement that the property, which is the qualifying property, has had at least $100,000 of prior expenditures over the previous 3 years. So when the company comes to list, we want to see that property have at least $100,000 of prior expenditures. Many instances we see companies that don't quite have that, or the spend has been occurred more than 3 years ago. So we can work with the company as long as the work program in that case is higher than the minimum work program here, which is the minimum work program is $200,000 on a Tier 2 property, and for the Tier 1 property, we see that at minimum work program being $500,000 And a tier 1 property ultimately is a property with a resource estimate that has a recommended budget of at least 500,000. So that covers the TSX Venture property requirements. For the TSX property requirements, again, you have the exploration category for TSX. The work program in that case is $750,000 of recommended work program. Again, that property needs to show at least a mineral resource estimate, a current mineral resource estimate. And all these, when I talk about a resource estimate and the work programs, all of that needs to be supported by a current technical report. So we get that information from the independent technical report that's filed along with the listing application. And then finally, for the TSX, we have the producer category, which is obviously an operating mine where there's proven and probable reserves and there's commercial production. And so there's, that's pretty much the requirements for the property there. Moving on from the property to the financial test, of course, listing comes with a financial test. We want to see companies. And again, this slide is separated into TSX Venture and TSX. So starting with the TSX Venture Tier 2 requirements, the financial test there is the company needs to show that it has adequate cash for at least 12 months. So what does that mean exactly? Well, we look at the company's planned work program, phase 1, the general and administrative expenses for the next 12 months. And any property payments or actually anything that comes up for payment over that 12-month period from the date of listing needs to be covered by the cash on hand. But in addition to that, there needs to be a buffer of at least $100,000 of cash that's just not allocated. So just as a cushion there for managing of risk and expenditures. So that's the Tier 2 venture listing requirements for the financial test. If we look at the Tier 1, in that case, we're looking at projections or adequate cash for 18 months. So we're going from 12 months to 18 months cash requirement, and the buffer there is increased to 200,000. So in a nutshell, that's the TSX Venture financial listing requirements. That means ultimately we see venture listings for financial, cash available of sometimes as low as 500, 600,000. That's pretty much the lowball entry level. So it gives you an idea. So of course it's for less advanced projects. When the projects are more advanced and they've reached, past resource estimate, they may be at the feasibility level or a significant amount of additional drilling, then usually we see that as a TSX exploration listing. In that case, for the TSX, we have the minimum working capital of $2 million. The company, again, has to have adequate funds for 18 months. So that's quite similar to TSX Venture Tier 1. We need projections where the company has adequate cash for 18 months. And then there's NTA requirement of 3 million. And of course, the capital structure needs to be adequate or appropriate. For the producer category on the TSX, we're looking at, the financial test is based essentially on the operating mine and the fact that it's generating revenues and profitability or likely profitability in the short or medium term. And it comes with an NTA requirement of 7.5 million and a show of pre-tax profits and cash flows. Now moving to the management requirements, pretty much any listing, whether it's mining or anything else, we bring a lot of attention to the management that's promoting it and conducting the listing operation. and the business going forward, of course. And we want to see management that has the adequate public company experience, both in terms of technical and financial requirements. So we need to see a management team that has a qualified chairman, the CEO, a CFO, and a corporate secretary. And one of the steps to going public is the background verifications of all these individuals. So all insiders, directors, and 10% shareholders plus will need to file personal information forms, and we conduct the background searches of the individuals to make sure they're suitable for the purpose of a listed company. Then moving on to being public, of course, means you have a minimum number of shareholders and a minimum number of public shares held by the public. So again, split between the TSX Venture Exchange requirements and the TSX requirements. So if we focus on the TSX Venture here, for the Tier 2 listing, we need at least 500,000 shares that are held by the public, 200 public shareholders. And I think, as Rich covered, at least 20% in the hand of the public shareholders. So, and for Tier 1, we're looking at a higher test of at least 1 million shares of public float, 250 public board lot shareholders, and that's it for the public distribution on venture. For TSX, we're looking at a publicly held value of publicly held shares of 4 million, and 1 million shares that are free trading, 300 public board lot shareholders in that case, and just to touch quickly here, in some situations, sponsorship is required, but there's a lot of situations where that isn't the case. So, yeah. Slide for that's pretty much it for the listing requirements on the TSX Venture. Now moving to the regulation that applies to mining companies on Canadian markets. So this is National Instrument 43-101. It covers standards of disclosure for mineral projects, and just high level here, the basic principles of National Instrument 43-101. Ultimately, well, that means for any Canadian listed company, all public disclosure that includes oral and written disclosure on the company's projects is subject to 43-101. Means presentations, news releases, of course, AIF disclosure, website. So all of that disclosure on the company's project is subject to 43-101. So it means companies need to use standardized terms and definitions that are actually outlined in the rule. The 43-101 establishes one basic principle being the qualified person. So the QP is involved in reviewing and approving the disclosure on behalf of the company, either on its websites or corporate presentations, press releases, or technical reports, of course. And finally here, the rule establishes what the requirements are for technical reports. So it actually outlines a table of contents on what exactly that technical report should cover off. So important to note here, it is a rule, so it is law. You have the left-hand side here where you have the components of the law, which is the instrument itself, the form, which is the technical report form, and all of this incorporates by reference the CIM definitions, which are Canadian industry definitions that determine mineral resources and reserves. And on the right-hand side here, you have the companion policy and guidelines that provide instructions on how to interpret different components of the rule. So in a nutshell here, what is national instrument, or what is it and what is it not? So it is a disclosure rule. So it's not a rule that says how you practice in the field and how you conduct the work. That is under the code of ethics of the professional associations. The National Instrument 43-101 is a disclosure rule, so it requires a way of presenting information. So in order to do this, the objectives are to present balance and information that is not misleading, information that is objective and unbiased. It standardizes terms such as reserves, resources, feasibilities, scoping studies, or preliminary economic analysis. So terms like that. It requires that assumptions be clearly explained and be reasonable. And of course, that information, the disclosure information, needs to be signed off by a QP, by a qualified person. So just to make sure here, it's not a guarantee of work quality. That, again, is under the responsibility of the individuals, the codes of ethics, and the company's way of conducting things. But once the information on the work is disclosed, that's where the rule applies. So, and it's not a recipe for resource estimation. That, again, is under the practice requirements. And one thing to note here is technical reports, once they're filed publicly on CDAR, it is not necessarily a document that is vetted. It is usually reviewed and covered off when there's a prospectus or a public offering, but there's many technical reports that are filed on CDAR, either voluntarily or for triggers under 43-101, but they're not all specifically reviewed and vetted. That is always under the company and the QP's responsibility to make sure that the documents are they follow the requirements and comply with 43-101. QP. So what is a QP? Ultimately, a QP is an engineer or geoscientist that meets the definition under section 1.1 of 43-101 of the rules. So ultimately, they have a degree, a university degree in geoscience or engineering that's related to exploration or mining. They have at least 5 years of experience in the field of mining or exploration. They have experience that is related to the project on which they're reported. So if the company has a gold project, obviously the QP needs to have that gold experience background. And the individual has to be in good standing with the professional association that is listed and recognized under 43-101. So, and of course, for Canada, that means ultimately all of the provinces pretty much have their own professional association that requires individuals, if they want to practice, to be registered with that professional association. But of course, there's a lot of QPs that are active around the world and have their own jurisdiction requirements. And therefore, 43-101, or at least the companion policy to 43-101, has provided a list of foreign associations that are recognized in terms of membership or professional association requirements outside of Canada. So the list is provided here. So QPs that are active, say in Brazil or Argentina, for that matter, need to make sure that they are registered, if not with a Canadian association, well, at least with one of these member foreign association. So that's a requirement in order to be QP. Following on the QP's responsibilities, well, ultimately the QP is responsible to prepare or review or approve the disclosure that is provided by the company. So either that's all written disclosure, so we're going from corporate presentations to news releases to websites. promotional posters that are provided in the context of conferences, for example, are also covered. So anything that is disclosed by the company on one of its material properties, well, that needs to be vetted or reviewed and approved by a CUPE. So pretty much covered off many of the CUPE responsibilities here, but they're obviously responsible for the technical reports and conducting site visits that are required to complete a technical report. So much of the the integrity and the credibility of the role relies on the QP and his responsibility and how they conduct their work. So independence, this is important in terms of independence requirements for the QP under 43-101. Ultimately, there needs to be an independent QP if there's a first-time disclosure of resources reserves, or if the company is providing a long-form prospectus. But pretty much outside of that, and also for just about any listing on the TSX or TSXV, QPs need to be independent in terms of signing off on the technical reports. But other than that, and that means like press releases that are provided by the issuer once listed, generally there's the companies use their own internal and therefore not independent QPs, and that's okay. It's allowed by the rule. The rule requires specific milestones where independence is required, but other than that, it's not always required. So here are some examples where independence would be considered compromised by regulators. Ultimately, if the individual has interests in either the company, the properties, or if it has been working for the company for the majority of its revenues for the past 3 years or so, well, you can see in those situations that it's likely that someone looking at the situation would consider the independence to be compromised. So this is not an exhaustive list, but it provides indications on what regulators may consider QPs to be non-independent. Touched on this a bit earlier, but in terms of listing on TSX and TSXV, generally the reports provided for the listing are always by independent QPs. There's unique situations where there's a company's at production level and has reached the maturity stage where sometimes it's allowable that QPs be the in-house QPs, but for early stage exploration and exploration listing on Venture or TSX, the independence is a must. Once listed on TSX Venture, companies obviously are seeking assets and acquisitions and sometimes conduct transactions where they acquire a significant mining asset. And in those situations, a technical report is also triggered. So, and in some situations, the technical report that needs to be provided has to be by independent QPs. In terms of specific triggers outside of the listing process for TSX, TSXV, so this is pretty much technical report triggers that are listed or are triggered under the rule under 43-101. So ultimately, these milestones are split into what we call them company milestones and property milestones. So if we look at company milestones, it means the company is going through a milestone such as it's a listing, it's doing a public financing, it's doing a takeover on another company. In that case, we refer to those as company milestones. But if we look, on the other hand, at property milestones, so the natural process for a mining property from early stage to production is, well, advancing with successful results on the property. So moving from exploration to mineral resource estimates, that is a trigger in itself for the filing of a technical report. If the project then moves on to a preliminary economic assessment, so a scoping study, in that case, that is also an additional milestone, which again triggers a new current independent technical report, and then moving ahead of that to the feasibility or previous feasibility stage where mineral reserves are determined. At that stage, there's also a trigger. So these are property milestones, and generally when these milestones, the property milestones, are triggered, there's a 45-day time frame for filing the technical report to support the disclosure. So schematically represented these milestones. You can see here from exploration to production. And maybe a bit more specifically on the TSX venture report trigger. So the TSX requirements, what's listed, the trigger is activated when there's the listing, of course, and then when there's any significant transaction that can ultimately result in an RTO or a reviewable transaction. So for the TSX, so the listing requirement at section 314, of course, the report is triggered where there's the listing of a producing mining company or either a advanced exploration or a development stage company. And for these situations, independence is required. So pretty much in a high-level presentation here, that's pretty much what I had to say. So thank you very much.